Hi, Kimiko. I'm so excited to be here with you to talk about foreign bodies. So I'm wondering if you would start out by reading us the title poem of the book.
Foreign body. This is a poem on my other's body. I mean, my mother's body. I mean, the one who saved her braid of blue-black hair in a drawer. I mean, the one I could lean against, as in insistence. Fuzzy dress of wuzzy one, red lipstick one, rubber gloves one, her one to me, badger, or so I heard. The one body I write on, her sun-flecked body, as she bathed in the afternoon. Was I 5? It was summer. Then winter, where today I call the unlocked bathroom to mind. I cannot leave her body alone, which is how I found Mother escaping the heat of a 1950s house, Father on a ladder with blowtorch to scrape the paint off the outside. Badger, badger. The sun in those suburbs simmered the tar roof over our rooms in the town where the wasps lived, inside paper cells, beneath both eaves and roots. They sing, sting very much, the wasps. Now I'm 60, sweet as dried papaya, my hair a bit tarnished, my inmost null. Memory is falling away, as if an image shattered to shards, then recollected for a kaleidoscope. I click the pieces into sharp arrangement. Bad, bad, girl, girl. In turn, a daughter turns sovereign.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I think that is obviously as sort of the title poem of the book. It touches so much on like the tactility, the object focus in the book, but also the focus on bodies. And so I want to start out asking you about some of the topics that the book opens with. So the way that small children ingest objects, and then you also bring in Dr. Chevalier Quixote Jackson, who's known as the father of endoscopy. And what I also see you doing is that the poems themselves are serving as like a kind of endoscope. So everything is like going down the hatch as you write of the speaker's experience, but then it's also brought back up. So it's just a really great metaphor for memory, for writing. And there's also this more literal thread that runs through the book about the adult children sorting through the objects of the parents' home. And sometimes that jarring feeling of, oh, I've brought up this object from my childhood. I wanted to talk to you about whether you view poetry as a kind of self-endoscopy, or what are some of the ways you're thinking about the endoscopy metaphor?
Hmm. Thank you. I guess I hadn't thought of it exactly in those terms. Uh, Maybe a little bit of a long answer to a short question. I first started writing the poem on Dr. Chevalier Quixote Jackson because I was intrigued by his collecting all 2,000 plus foreign bodies, things that he took out of children's upper respiratory system. Um, he collected them and then donated them to what is now called the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. So he was a bit of a hoarder, and that intrigued me. Why he was holding on to these objects for other, because there's something aside from scientific reason. So that intrigued me, his connection to objects. Um, at the same time, while this was going on, my sister and I were dealing with my father, who was a hoarder. Obviously, I collect things myself. So what are these objects? And also a poem is a kind of object as well. So what is our relationship to these objects around us? How do objects in turn possess us, how can I make a poem that is as revealing, as beautiful, hopefully, even if painful, as an object, as a beautiful object, piece of artwork. And yes, we have these objects. Well, the children literally had them in their bodies, but we have them in our memory. So yes, absolutely, we excavate them, we take them out of our bodies, we lay them bare, so to speak, right? And the process, I think, when it's really working best, it's issuing from the same place where our dreams abide, right? That sort of unconscious, subconscious realm. And those were that's so. I guess maybe we hoard those images, or we keep them. Maybe we don't hoard them completely, especially if we bring them up to bear. Did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
I should actually show the cover of the book because it has some of the actual objects that are in the Moody Museum that Dr. Jackson took out of children's bodies. They're quite extraordinary.
That's so interesting. Where is that museum?
It's in Philadelphia. And it was once called, I believe, the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And it's an extraordinary museum. It just has all sorts of interesting scientific things. Some we don't really want to talk about because they're a little bizarre.
That's legit.
But everyone should go look on their website and when in Philadelphia. I mean, it's a reason to actually go to Philadelphia aside from all the other great reasons. It's a terrific city.
Cool, cool. So there's so much in this book. I'm gonna jump around a little bit. Another section that stood out for me was the extended poetic address, the apostrophe to the sculptor Isamu Noguchi. And you quote him directly. This stood out for me. He said or wrote once, "To be hybrid anticipates the future," which of course can be applied so much as like a commentary on America, which I think is how maybe he originally meant it. But I'm also thinking about it on a craft level, and the use of that line in your work kind of suggests the idea that genre hybridity anticipates the literary future. And so I know that you're known as, and I think identify as, a poet, though I know many readers view your books as hybrid works, and I know you've collaborated with filmmakers and visual artists. So I'm wondering if you identify as a hybridist, or is it even useful to make that distinction?
I don't really. I view my collaborations as sort of one part of what I do. Maybe people think of my work as hybrid because I've engaged with this Japanese genre called the zuihitsu. And the zuihitsu itself, especially from a Western point of view, is a hybrid or can be a hybrid text. It's almost impossible to define. I'm actually writing an essay on it right now, and it's crazy just trying to find a definition. But I submit that that part of the definition is, in fact, it can contain different genres in one piece, in one text. So I've actually taken that genre, and I've been a little reckless with it. I have to say, in my past work, what I've done may be closer to a collage at times. So I've called them zuihitsu, and I've been mindful, and I've been exploring the form. But in doing so, I've looked a lot at collage collages, and also the modernists. So I wouldn't call what I've done in the past hybrid per se, but I am looking forward
Mm.
and collecting images lately and thinking about, who knows when this will happen, because I collect things and then I sit with them for a while and what am I going to do with this? So I've been collecting both antique postcards and also some carte de visite and cabinet photos from the 1800s, and thinking about how I want to use them on particular themes. So there may be some actual bona fide text in my future, that would use both eh, visual, and language.
Cool. Thank you. I'm also really interested in this craft essay at the end of the book that you've included. And I was thinking about how the presence of a craft essay in a poetry book might be viewed by some as a foreign body in the book. Uh, but I really loved it because I just, it, it's always what I want when I read a poetry book, is to hear from the poet about, here's my thinking, here's why I did what I did. So would you talk a little bit about your decision to include that craft essay?
Sure. Even now I go back and forth a little bit with feeling a little sheepish, like, really? Wrote about your own work, isn't that for other people to do? Um, but I want to talk about my influences. I wanted to talk about how a collection that may seem to have very little to do with Japanese aesthetics is very informed by my own hybridity, to go back to that word. Um, I wanted to write about that. I wanted to claim it. I wanted to foreground it if possible. And I guess to be understood a little bit in that context. So that was one aim that I have. I actually wrote an essay for brain fever where I did something where I have a little essay very similar. Um, and the idea to do that in the first place came from an invitation by David Bonanno, who he died a few years ago, but he was the editor, one of the poetry editors at American Poetry Review. And he asked me when they published some of my work to write a little bit on why, how did this poem, come into being? And I thought, oh, well, if I expand this, might be fun, might be illuminating. And then I thought, for foreign bodies, why not take that a little bit further, as I myself keep going back to Japanese aesthetics and how I want to sort of collide, have that Eastern Western collide, not divide, but collide.
Mhm.
So that was my thinking. Sometimes I do think, though, why did you do that? Glad. So thank you for telling me that it was, I guess, kind of fun or of interest. I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah, it was great to read it and then go back with that in mind, and then to see you making some of those moves in real time as I read through the book again.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, the some of the poems I wrote, like the object lessons on Dr. Shivai Kahote Jackson and hoarding and objects, I'd written years ago. I wrote in about 2014, actually, and it just didn't work. There were a couple poems like that just didn't work. The Ashes didn't work until I really went back and read more and thought about what I wanted to do in terms of craft, and then really moved in and really wrestled with both those pieces. So that poem really changed over the years, and partly having to do with wrangling with poetics, And in the case of the ashes in particular, with reading a lot of Emily Dickinson. So there's the Western component.
Cool, cool. That's a good segue into the next question I have for you. I wanted to talk about the poem Divine, which deals with the story of Song Yang, who was a victim of police abuse in New York City. And the speaker talks about Song Yang as well as the speaker's own subject position as a poetry professor in the same city nearby to where this happened. And then this is the Emily Dickinson tie-in. Lines from Emily Dickinson enter this poem as like a kind of foreign body or imported text. And for me, it really accurately, these collisions really accurately conveyed what it can be like sometimes to be an educator while the world is happening around us, and then we're in the classroom talking about words. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the questions for you that Divine is asking and seeking to answer?
Oh, well, one question might actually be the place of poetry in people's lives. I think that poetry is already out there. And it's true, some people are afraid of poetry. Some people don't read poetry because they think they've been taught, actually, by abusive educators, that they can't understand it, that it is going to be foreign, that it, in fact, can only be experienced with some sort of guide. And one thing that I hope happens in that poem is to really make clear that some of my students have been reading poetry, they, in maybe even their own language, because many of my students are immigrants or come from immigrant backgrounds, families. So I wanted to, here's the professor, right, teaching this quintessential American poet, Emily Dickinson. And it's a poem about bias and prejudice, which I don't think most people know, color, caste, denomination. It's an amazing poem. I didn't know it existed for a long time. But I wanted to get the feeling across that poetry actually is everywhere. My students, many have read it. And what is that relationship then to me? What is the relationship of poetry, of literature in people's lives? It could be an oral tradition. I don't know. It could be something they heard someone in their family reciting or reading out loud. I don't know, or singing perhaps. But I'm hoping that comes across because it isn't just about a poet coming and reading and bringing poetry to people. I mean, that does happen. That's a pleasure. But it's also knowing that poetry actually is already there. So I wanted to bring that to bear in the poem.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's so much in that poem about what students are bringing to the classroom in terms of like poetic experiences, social location, life experiences. It is just a great acknowledgement of that. Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So this is my last question for you. So there's a lot of work in this book about double meanings or multiple meanings of words. So for instance, like object and object as a noun and a verb is just one of a plethora of examples. And you write in that craft essay, such changeability can make for productive ambiguity. A simple word becomes a portal out of its dictionary definitions and out of logical sense. Such usage resists easy context and linear thinking. So as the last question, I'm wondering, what's your advice for writers who want to seek out that changeability and want to subvert linear thinking in their own work?
Um, Again, this comes in part from Japanese poetics. Japanese is what at least used to be called vocabulary poor, which means there are fewer, I guess, sounds, for example. So the sound SHI means poetry, death, and the number 4. So if you use that sound in a poem, in a Japanese poem, where am I going with this? Or it means one thing, but you also hear all these other meanings, right? Um, Sometimes we think of puns as just being funny or clever, but I view it as being a way to pressurize language and having it work really, really hard. So if I talk about a vanity in my bedroom, it's a piece of furniture, but I also hope that the word vanity somehow comes up, uh, vain, right? One feeling that kind of vanity as well. I want the reader to be a little, uh, maybe experience a little vertigo in a sense as they zoom around. And that's what I mean by spatial. It's nonlinear. How to do that? Well, I have just happen to have, because I'm sitting in my little study, this old school thesaurus, which has in the back, you have to look up the words in the back, and then you go to where the words are, and it is a rabbit hole. It is this kind of thesaurus is a kind of portal, because it's so generous in what it gives writers. So I will use this. I'll also do the easy route and go on my computer thesaurus, but to really see what's available to me.
Mm.
I know there are some writers who say, never use a thesaurus. It should really be words that come from, your own pool of diction. But I'll use whatever I can. I'm not proud. I'm shameless. And I think it's important to broaden. I can't think of all the words I might want to use. They might not come to mind. So thesaurus, see what the opportunities are, even for one word, one phrase, and how to rupture the line so that you create that kind of portal. You create that language is so unstable.
Mm.
So why not take advantage of that, right? Because if we clarify too much, it's going to be too stable. There's not going to be any electricity. There's not going to be any alchemy, right? But if we allow it a kind of balance between that stability and instability, that's when all this sort of magic happens.
Great. That's a really great note to end on. For
Although
everyone.
I think we're supposed to mention, sorry, I think we're supposed to mention the fair, and that people should come to the fair, go to the YouTube. Do you have that information?
Yeah, so I think it's Miami Book Fair online. Google Miami Book Fair online. It's real easy to sign up for all of the events. Yeah, check it out. And definitely pick up a copy of Foreign Bodies, everyone who's reading this. It's a really great book. I only have the ebook version, but if I had the physical book, I would hold it up right here.
Well, I'll hold it up because
Great.
it's because the publisher Norton did such a great job. They made a beautiful book.
Yeah.
So Norton, you get to see some of Dr. Shivai Quixote Jackson's objects. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time.